Welcome everyone. First of all, I would like to express my great attitude that I can take part in such a distinguished conference. And in my presentation, I would like to talk something deeper and a bigger structure. As Professor Zhang Qi mentioned, that there are 3 levels to investigate the relationship between China and Central Eastern Europe. However, I would recommend one more, the global perspective. And first, it seems to be quite strange. However, I find this very interesting. So I try to talk about this in my presentation. The title of my paper is Setting New International Rules and the Belt and Road Initiative from a Central European Perspective. If I'm not mistaken, in the 1 or 2 decades, one of the most important questions in international politics was whether China wants to be a rule setter or a rule follower, international actor. This question had long been unanswered since China followed the so-called low-profile foreign policy after the Cold War. But I think in the recent years there is a serious shift in the Chinese foreign policy. So if we think just about the presentation or the speech held by President Xi at the World Economic Forum in 2017, we see that Chinese leadership thinks that China's right and duty to be a more active player in international politics, and they see China as an active rule setter power. But if we know that China wants to be a rule setter power, we have to first investigate the attitude of the Chinese leadership toward the current international order. I'm pretty sure that many of you is familiar with Madame Fuin's speech was held at the Munich Security Conference in 2016, where she mentioned that the current US-led world order has 3 pillars: the American value system or the Western values, the US alignment system, which provides a security foundation for the US leadership, the third, the international institutions, which were mostly created after the Second World War, like the UN or the Bretton Woods institutions. According to Madame Fui, she mentioned that China's motivation is just to support the 3rd pillar. However, new mechanisms are necessary to reform this last pillar in order to provide more interest for the developing countries and China itself. And one of the mechanisms she has mentioned was the Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, several scholars in the world, and especially in the West, see the Belt and Road Initiative more than just a new mechanism, but more an alternative international order. The basic skeleton of this initiative is the so-called 5 connectivity, which was also mentioned in this session today as well, which would provide a special position for China in the international order. So implementing these 5 connectivity would provide a special position, a leading position for China in the international order. However, according to my view, the Belt and Road Initiative in itself would not be a real challenge for the current international order, since it does not want to change the rules of the game in the international system. So it means that this can be more can be regarded as a democratization process of the international order, since we don't really know that does China want to fill this framework with new international institutions or organizations. However, according to my view, this process has also started, and in the next part of my presentation I would like to focus on one of a new multilateral organization, which is a 16+1 cooperation, because filling the Belt and Road Initiative as a framework with these new multilateral organizations, that could mean a real challenge for the current international order. But first of all, we have to define that the 16+1 cooperation is a real multilateral organization or not. Since several scholars in Europe, especially in west part of Europe, stated that it is not really a multilateral organization, but more a tool to interfere in European politics. So in this slide, I collected the most important characteristics and most important definitions for multilateral organizations. First of all, we can see that a multilateral organization has to be created by formal instruments of governments or non-state actors, and that is the case for the 16+1 cooperation. It is created by 16 European countries and China. The second important characteristic is that it has to have a common interest. And the interest in this case is that all the countries who take part in this mechanism or cooperation tries to make their national policy more effective and put their national policies further into a trans-regional level. The third characteristic of a multilateral organization is that it has formal bodies and regular plenary sessions. That is also the case for the 16+1 cooperation. We know that the most important body is the Secretariat, and however it has several sub-bodies and of course has regular plenary sessions as well. The most important is the China Central and Eastern European Countries Summit, which is held annually. And the last characteristic for a real multilateral organization is that it has to have a development process. And this was also mentioned today, that there is quite a big result in this development process, since in the first few years the framework was created, and this has already shifted into a new development stage, a shifted into a new development stage. After formulating this institutional framework, it started to be filling with content, especially via implementing common projects. So according to this definition, it is no doubt that the 16+1 cooperation is a real multilateral organization. So it is not just a tool for China to interfere in European policies. But does this have any novum or specialties for the international politics? So it can be, we can regard the 16+1 cooperation just a challenge for the international order if it has some specialties. Not surprising, according to my view, it has several specialties, and this was also mentioned partly today sessions as well. First important characteristic is of the 16+1 cooperation, the loose institutionalized character, which means that institutional arrangement in different mechanisms has no strict pattern. Each country or entity can decide whether to join the relevant mechanism for cooperation or not on a voluntary basis. Why is this important? It is important because, according to the traditional concept of a multilateral organization, the loose institutionalized character is a classical weak point, a weak characteristic for a multilateral organization. However, for the 16+1 cooperation, this can be also an advantage as well, since it makes the organization more flexible and result-oriented. The second characteristic of the cooperation was also mentioned today, that this group of the European countries have very different cultural, political background, historical experiences. Some of them are part of the NATO and the European Union, and some of them are not. And however, not to mention China, how much China is different from these European countries. This is very important, that the 16+1 cooperation openly build up on the heterogeneity of these countries. This was also a characteristic which traditionally regarded as a weak point for a multilateral organization. However, in this case, it has also some it has some advantages as well, because the 16+1 cooperation try not to force the countries into an obligatory homogeneity, which saves a lot of effort to focus more on practical results. The fourth characteristic of the 16+1 cooperation is that However, the cooperation has a very comprehensive, sorry, 2 minutes, okay. So it's very comprehensive from one hand, however, it's very much focusing on economy. So the most important sphere of the cooperation is economy, which also means that the cooperation is less value-based, but more more result-oriented and flexible. The fifth characteristic of this cooperation is that it has a very much planned framework, follows the guidelines which are introduced yearly, and which are also monitored and also is important to make the development of the relationship. The sixth typical characteristic of the cooperation is that it has no contrary position toward the current international order, since the medium-term agenda states that the cooperation has to conform to the US legislation. And the next characteristic is also very important. The 16+1 cooperation fits very well into China's other new mechanism or cooperations. So, according to my view, there are several similarities between the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the 16+1 cooperation. So, let's go to the conclusion. So first, according to my view, China's new rule-setter foreign policy, combined with the Belt and Road Initiative, which can be regarded as a framework, and these new multilateral institutions means a real challenge for the current international order. However, I don't see this as a clash between the new and the old order, but rather as a supplementary process. Actually, the main challenge is that these new institutions can be interpreted as a necessary change reflecting to the reality of this multipolar world. So the world is changing. The US and the leading European powers have to give up their superior position as the masters of the international order, have to adopt a more pragmatic attitude toward the Belt and Road Initiative and the new institutions. Second, the world is shifting toward the new period of globalizations, which several scholars call the globalization 2.0, which means that new ideals and new institutions are necessary to be introduced. According to my view, the 16+1 cooperation can be one model of this kind of these new organizations, since it is less value-based but more result-oriented and flexible. The next characteristic is that since it has several similarities with other cooperations, as I mentioned, like FOCAC, it must have some cultural background, some similar way of thinking and some worldview. So according to my ideal, this non-Western approach in international politics have a sense, like when we're talking about win-win or the openness of the Belt and Road Initiative, which sounds quite strange for the Western ears, actually has real, according to my view, has some real meaning and has a deep cultural background of this question. And finally, I think the 16+1 cooperation can be a model for the European Union and for the relationship for the European Union and China as well inside of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I would recommend one more thing, that after Brexit, we need also new solutions inside the European Union to manage the relationship with the European Union and the new periphery like Great Britain and the old periphery like the Balkan. And probably the 16+1 cooperation can be also, I would not say a model to follow, but at least we can get some ideas from this approach. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm waiting for your questions. Thank you.